Before the success stories, the progress, there was you. You who made a choice to grow, to inspire, to overcome your own challenges. At NASM, we're in service of your limitless potential because when you keep growing, we all get stronger. And we'll never stop making your journey our mission. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified personal trainer.
You're listening to the NASM CPT podcast with Rick Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM CPT podcast. My name is Rick Richey, and today we are now moving from the dynamic assessments on page 811 of the NASM CPT 7 textbook. We are moving to static assessments. We're going to go over two things this episode and then in the following episode. This one will be lower cross syndrome, and the next one will be upper cross syndrome, and just give you a better idea of what those things are. Understand what muscles may be contributing to the position, both in terms of tightness and in terms of weakness. And so we're going to address this. A lower cross syndrome, just so you see. So a syndrome itself is kind of a group of symptoms, a group of things that could potentially be the case out of a list of things. And so we're addressing only from the category of muscles that are potentially tight and muscles that are potentially underactive. And so as we go through this, we're going to look at what that might mean only in terms of this. So if it comes to anything else, if there's an injury, if there is some type of position of the spine or the pelvis that you're born with, like a congenital thing, nothing. No, we're not going to address any of that stuff, only if muscles are tight. Now, how do you know? Yeah, you necessarily don't. But this is what we're going to address in terms of this, because I think most come from a neurological adaptation based off of positional repetition. And because you stay in a position for a very long period of time, then you start to get tight in that position. So there's the assumption that we will move forward with. So a lower cross syndrome is a combination of what we call an anterior pelvic tilt, an arch in the low back. So the low back is arched. So it's basically standing up tall and sticking the butt out behind you, which arches the low back and it tilts the pelvis forward. Now, this is where a lot of people get confused too. So you're saying, I'm sticking my butt out, but my pelvis is tilting forward. Why is it called an anterior tilt, not a posterior tilt if I'm sticking my butt out? Well, that has to do about where we identify the direction of movement. And we don't identify the direction of movement from the posterior. If we're looking at the pelvis from, let's say, the side, the direction that we're looking at movement is the top of the pelvis, not the bottom of the pelvis. And it is the front of the pelvis, not the back of the pelvis. So when I'm looking at you from the front or from the side, and the pelvis, the top of the pelvis moves forward, that means the sacrum, the posterior part of the backside sticks out. And anyway, it's your butt sticking out and your pelvis tilts forward, causes the low back to arch. What are some of the things that lead to that? What are muscles that might be short, tight, overactive that lead to that? And what are muscles that may be weak and need to be at least woken up a little bit to say, hey, well, can you keep me in a more neutral position? Lower cross syndrome, overactive muscles, hip flexors, and lumbar extensors. All right, so let's talk about this. A position of the pelvis shifted forward in an anterior tilt is hip flexion. It is pelvis on top of femur, hip flexion. Just like if I were standing up and I lifted my leg up, that is femur, that is the femur moving into flexion with a stable pelvis. Well, anterior pelvic tilt is a stable femur and the pelvis is moving into hip flexion on top of it. So the hip flexors are big contributors to that pelvis on top of femur hip flexion. It is the anterior, they are anterior rotators of the pelvis. Now, if hip flexion is doing that, we want to look at what those muscles are. And that could include all of the following to some degree: the iliacus, the psoas, the TFL, the rectus femoris, even the adductors can be hip flexors. The sartorius is a hip flexor. All of these muscles are hip flexors. So when we say hip flexors, I know a lot of times we refer to just like the iliacus and the psoas as the hip flexors because they tend to be referred to as the primary or dominant hip flexor muscles, but all of these muscles contribute to hip flexion. They are all hip flexors. But I do agree that the psoas has a um, particularly focused attention in this syndrome. And the reason being is that it also can extend the lumbar spine. Strangely enough, it also has the capacity to flex the lumbar spine. Let's go with the psoas paradox. But as the pelvis goes into an anterior pelvic tilt, rather than flexing, sometimes as the psoas attaches to the lumbar spine, instead of immediately creating flexion, it can create extension to shorten that position. So we're looking at a muscle that helps to create the extension in the lumbar spine. It helps to create the anterior tipping of the pelvis. It is flexing the pelvis on top of the femurs. So it's contributing in both particular components of this lower cross syndrome. Lower cross syndrome, of course, just standing there. You're looking at somebody from the side, which is generally the best place to see it. It looks like their low back is arched and their backside is really sticking out. It's important also to note that some people have bigger backsides than others. And just because you see the backside sticking out, it does not mean that they have an anterior pelvic tilt, which is why you have to pay attention to the position of the spine and the sacrum, not just the gluteus maximus. So we got two overactive muscles. Let's look at the underactive muscles that could be allowing this movement to take place. We have a list of them here. A much more exhaustive list than you see in the overactive muscles. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of either category, but we do see 4 muscles here in the underactive group. We're looking at the glute max and glute medius. I'm going to put those together because they both have contributing factors here. The gluteus maximus is the strong hip extensor that we have, and we have a lot of hip extensors. Gluteus medius, posterior fibers, can hip extend. Even though it is mostly a frontal plane muscle, it can also extend the hip. Also, we do see sometimes when the gluteus medius, we see people go into adduction, that creates an anterior pelvic tilt. So a knock knee position oftentimes can lead to an anterior pelvic tilt. Now, we're not necessarily putting those together, but just to know that they can often go together if the knee is not. It's hard. It's hard. If you stand up and you try to knock your knees without letting your pelvis go forward and your back arching, it's actually quite challenging. It's easier if your knees knock. You just shift your pelvis forward and arch your back and stand up higher, and it feels more comfortable. So, but that's just because that's how the patterns are with the body. It's not always that way, but they do tend to go together. We also have another hip extensor, relatively strong group of hip extensors, in fact, called the hamstrings. And so if I am hip flexed, one of the things that will help to put me into a posterior pelvic tilt are going to be the hamstring muscles. All 3 of the hamstring muscles, we'll just call it the hamstring group, they all posterior tilt, and through posterior tilt bring us back into a neutral position is what our goal is. Can we find a neutral position, strengthen in that neutral position? So gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, the hamstrings, all on the posterior side of the body. We have another muscle we're going to look at on the anterior side of the body. That's the rectus abdominis. The rectus abdominis is a significant posterior tilter of the pelvis. It helps to create spinal flexion. It does posterior tilt. And it's on the front of the body. Now, when you have those two working together, you have the muscles on the backside creating a posterior tilt by pulling down, the rectus abdominis on the front side pulling up on the front of the pelvis, and that creates this force coupling. And they force couple together to create that tilt. Or what we're looking for here actually is to get out of the other tilt, to get out of the anterior pelvic tilt. And so we want to work those muscles together. You can work them individually, actually. Work them individually, help to strengthen the glute medius maximus, help to strengthen the hamstrings. A lot of times people focus hamstring on at the knee. This one you would particularly want to focus on hip extension version of hamstring activities. And that could be things like RDLs, straight leg hamstring bridges, things like that, where you're focusing on hip extension. And then you could do crunches. You could do posterior tilts sitting on a ball. But then you want to work together and try to get them to all work in unison and in tandem after you've gone through and stretch some of the short, tight, overactive muscle, and do some foam rolling on the short, tight, overactive muscle, individual activations, and then see if you can move in a global and integrated movement pattern and stay neutral. So one more time, we'll go through the list here that we give on page 811 with a lower cross syndrome. What muscles are potentially overactive? Hip flexors. That's one of two. And then the next one are the lumbar erectors. Oh, I realized I did not say the lumbar erectors. The muscle on the back that lifts up, the hip flexors are on the front and they pull the pelvis down. So when those work together, one side's pulling up, the other side's pulling down just on different sides of the body, creates an anterior pelvic tilt. Hamstrings, glutes on one side of the body, the rectus abdominis on the other. They work in opposition on opposite sides of the body, and they pull in a same force couple direction, and that will create the posterior tilt. So anterior tilt, hip flexors, and lumbar extensors, the underactive muscles that we're looking to strengthen: glute maximus, glute medius, hamstrings, and abdominals. And I would even go as far as saying that the abdominals could be more than the rectus abdominis. It is the muscles of the abdominals. I think that the external obliques, the internal obliques, both are posterior tilters of the pelvis. They both can do flexion of the spine, and they can contribute in that movement pattern as well. All right, we're in the weeds and we're closing it out. So I know that could be a lot of information, but we get a lot of questions about lower cross syndrome. And so lower cross syndrome, you just want to have a better understanding of what it is and what muscles can contribute to that and what muscles you need to strengthen. This is the episode for you. All right, thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. And if you want to reach out to me, do it. You can hit me up on Instagram at dr.rickricchey, or you can email me, rick.richey@nasm.org. Y'all keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.